In Flanders fields, the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place. And in the sky, the larks still bravely singing fly scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved. And now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch, be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields. This famous verse comes from Canadian physician and Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae. As you may be able to infer based on his somewhat romanticized view of the nobility of death, McCrae wrote this poem in the early days of World War I, when patriotic fervor was high, as was optimism that victory would be sure and quick. This is one of the most celebrated poetic tributes to fallen soldiers in literature, studied by school children all over this country, including my own former students back when I taught high school English literature. But I never taught in Flanders fields in isolation. I always paired it with another famous poem, also written during the First World War. Now, this poem differed significantly in that it was written by a soldier near the end of the war, after the world had suffered nearly 18 million deaths. This poem was written by Second Lieutenant Wilfred Owen. Less than a year after completing it, Owen was killed in combat 1 week before armistice. He was 25 years old. The title of his poem, Dulce et decorum est, alludes to a famous line of Latin verse penned by the Roman poet Horace that would have been well known to British soldiers of the day. The full Latin phrase translates to English thusly: "It is sweet and honorable to die for one's country." Bent double, like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge till on the haunting flares we turned our backs and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on bloodshod. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. Gas, gas, quickly, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets on just in time, but sometimes someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime, dim through the misty panes and thick green light as under a green sea. I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If, in some smothering dreams, you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face like a devil's sick of sin. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling forth from froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, You would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori. One of the things I love about Unitarian Universalism, and this church specifically, is that we can hold on to several truths at once. We affirm that good and reasonable people can, in the practice of this faith, have differing beliefs, can come to different conclusions about how best to express our most deeply held values. And that includes the diversity of views we all hold regarding war and peace, the proper role of the American military in the world, the effect of the military-industrial complex in sustaining conflict around the globe. Regarding these diverse beliefs represented here among us, which are literally matters of life and death, I have always been impressed by the way we have been able to maintain respect for one another and remain amicably connected to one another through our disagreements. And as you might imagine, in the midst of such diverse philosophical, moral, and religious views regarding war and the use of military force more generally, few statements, few declarations could possibly inspire universal agreement. But this morning, I'd like to nominate this one. War is hell. I hope that is a truth we can all recognize and agree upon, regardless of what each of us may believe about the morality of war more abstractly, whether we are pacifists or just war theorists, whether we are military isolationists or interventionists. I would hope that each of us, that every American, every human being, could agree that war, no matter the context, is by definition both a tragedy and a horror. It is the evidence and consequence of failed diplomacy. It is by very nature destructive to life, and as such should always be considered a last resort, if considered at all. Memorial Day, of course, is not a celebration of war. Rather, it is the day that we as a nation collectively take a moment to honor our military men and women who gave their lives in service to this country, often in the context of war. At least that's what we're supposed to be doing this Memorial Day weekend. In other words, contrary to what appears to be popular opinion, Memorial Day is not just about cookouts and shopping at outlet malls. To truly and earnestly honor those who gave their lives in service to our country, we need more than coupons and hot dogs. In fact, we need more than the waving of flags or even the laying of flowers. The best way civilians can honor fallen soldiers is by being part of a politically engaged, vigilant citizenry that holds our federal representatives accountable for the decisions they make regarding our military. We best honor those who have died for us by making sure our elected public servants truly value the sanctity of life, by making sure they vote as if they truly believe that military conflict is a last resort rather than a convenient political or economic tool, by ensuring that they refuse to put the lives of our children at risk unless it is absolutely necessary. So to put it another way, politic and civic disengagement is perhaps the greatest insult we can pay to those who have died in service to this country. We live in a democracy. Granted, it's not the strongest of democracies. And honestly, it never has been. Over time, over our history, our democracy has strengthened and weakened, waxed and waned. And right now, it is fair to say that it is under attack. It is a bruised and battered democracy, one that has been brought to its knees by powerful special interests, both foreign and domestic. Yet in spite of all of its failures and shortcomings, I still believe that we are a country of the people, by the people, and for the people. We can't stop believing that. We cannot afford to stop believing that, even though many of us, quite understandably, feel powerless sometimes to stop the juggernaut-like machinery of state once it is in motion, to resist the political inertia of decades and centuries, to untangle the wicked problems that have disempowered, disillusioned, and domesticated we, the people. The day that we, the people, lose faith in our own power to change our nation is the day that America dies. The buck stops with we, the people. So that means that we, the people, ultimately decide and must bear some measure of responsibility for the decision whether or not we send our children to war. One of the very important things that sets military folks off from the rest of us is that the men and women of the military subordinate their will to the state. When they enlist, they voluntarily give up at least a part of their right to exercise their freedom of conscience. Now, all Americans, and especially Unitarian Universalists, we should recognize what an immense sacrifice this truly is, what an incredible act of trust, what an incredible act of faith this is. For a season, our women and men of our armed forces, they choose to suspend their right to choose. They give up their own authority to decide whether or not they themselves will live or die. They even grant us the authority to authorize them to kill other human beings. This is the heaviest of moral responsibilities. And as citizens of this nation, we must each bear our fair share of this weight. Our servicemen and women place their faith, their sacred trust in we the people of the United States. When they put on that uniform, they put their lives and a part of their humanity into our hands. We must therefore aspire to be worthy of this great faith they are putting in us. That means we cannot abscond from our civic duty and our moral responsibility to make sure that our public servants always consider the real and very human cost of every act of war they authorize. And no level of faux patriotic American military fetishization can replace that vigilance. No matter how many flags we wave, no matter how many free meals we offer to soldiers at restaurants, no matter how many millions of tax dollars the Department of Defense spends to pay NFL teams to salute our soldiers. It was $5.4 million, by the way. None of that can replace using our vote and our voice to make sure that our political leaders view our servicemen and servicewomen as human beings and not simply numbers at the bottom of a ledger. America's fetishization of military service is symptomatic of a larger problem facing our country right now: the proliferation of cheap and easy fake patriotism that costs us absolutely nothing. There is a fine line between a healthy, robust appreciation for all that our military folks have sacrificed for each of us. There's a difference between that and perpetuating a cult of military worship that in the end summation often expresses itself as a lot of pomp and circumstance, a lot of sound and fury, ultimately signifying nothing. Excessive fawning over military service is often a kind of psychological overcompensation that many politically disengaged Americans use to salve their consciences for passively allowing military men and women to be used in economic and geopolitical games that most of us would rather not think about. Big displays of public gratitude with little else undergirding is the relatively cheap fee that many of us American civilians gladly pay to wash our hands of any guilt associated with refusing to hold ourselves accountable for every U.S. military death. It is easier, after all, for many of us to simply applaud a uniformed soldier boarding the same airplane as us occasionally than it is to continue to read the news, to vote responsibly and regularly, or communicate with our congressional representatives and demand that they make substantive policy changes to better take care of our veterans and to avoid unjustified military excursions. True patriotism is far more than simply thanking a uniform for their service. As a nation, we are struggling right now to understand what it means to be patriotic. And how we choose to define patriotism now will ultimately define the America we are to become. Cheap, performative displays of loyalty paired with nothing else is no substitute for acts of real sacrifice and service to both the people and the values of this country. So why are we discussing this here and now? Why do we celebrate Memorial Day at church? One function of religion is to help us make meaning of both suffering and dying. And so I think it behooves us on this Memorial Day weekend to try and understand what, in the grand scheme of things, the suffering and dying of our military men and women, what it means, what it should mean to each of us. But not only does religion help us make meaning of suffering and dying, I believe it should also inspire us to prevent needless suffering and dying. And a religion that fails to do that ain't worth a damn, so to speak. Unitarian Universalists and people of all faith, we have a responsibility to live responsibly. We are responsible to and for one another. Human life, self-awareness, consciousness, it's such an awe-inspiring gift. Whether you believe it came about by intention and design of some divine being, or whether you believe it evolved purely by chance, beating 1,000,000,000 odds, life is a gift. And it would be a shame to waste such a glorious gift by being selfish with it. Life is relational. The English word religion is derived from the Latin word religare, which means to bind together. The word ligament is related to it. A ligament is connective tissue that binds together bones or cartilage. So religion is where we come to hold each other together. That very idea is reflected in our Unitarian Universalist seventh principle, which affirms that we are part of a vast interconnected web of existence. And any idea that seeks to break us apart from one another, that threatens to destroy or weaken our relationships, that perversely incentivizes us to place our individual selves above the needs of our community, that is opposed to the fundamental principles of our faith. Every relationship is an opportunity to live our faith, including the relationship between the citizenry and our military. And healthy relationships have balance and reciprocity. Our military protects our citizenry, and so our citizenry must also protect our military. This weekend, we rightfully honor our fallen dead, those who served us with honor and did exactly what we, through our elected officials, asked them to do. That includes both sacrificing their lives and taking others. It includes subordinating their will to ours, suspending their freedom of choice and their right of conscience, all to do what we told them was for the greater good. They not only gave their lives, they gave up a piece of their humanity because we asked them to. And so we are grateful this morning for those who believe that there are things in this world worth dying for, and then proved it through their selfless service. As we honor them today, we are mindful also of those who currently serve this country. They too will do what we ask. They too are prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice if and when we ask. For their sake, let us never ask lightly. Blessed be.